Okay, thank you. I thank the ICC committee for inviting me into this position to summarize what's been happening in creation paleontology and my thoughts for the future. As every speaker has experienced in this position, I realize I've got to somehow take the 14 hours and present it to you in 30 minutes, and I have to, there's no clock here, is there? So I'm going to have, you're going to give me what, a 10 and a 5 and the hook. Okay, good, we're ready to go. Obviously then, in that sense, I can only give highlights. I am not going to give proper accolades to the many who have contributed to the field over time. So I'm just going to give you a 30,000-foot view, at least my 30,000-foot view of paleontology and creationism. I like to understand fossils to be something of a window of insight into organisms of the past and processes of the past. And so the talk will have two parts. First, our insights into the organisms of the past, and then a bit of consideration of how fossils give us insight into the processes of the past. You can understand the fossil record as a stack of rocks with the fossils in those rocks. Conceive of I picture the fossil record being sort of a human thing. These human rocks, are reaching out and grabbing a sample of critters and plants and everything else that lived at a particular time and preserving them. And then a bit later, reaching out and sampling a few of those and so on. So the fossil record is sampling from among the organisms that lived at various times, starting from the bottom where it's sampling early in Earth history, and then moving up to the top, sampling to the very recent. So again, focusing on organisms of the past. The field of Baraminology, the attempt to identify created kinds and study those kinds, it initiated really with studies in living organisms, but since Baraminology was introduced by a paleontologist, from the very beginning, it had some consideration with fossils. And one thing that I think is interesting that sort of everyone has overlooked through time is that as we look at the Baraminology of living organisms alone and the Baraminology of fossils, it's again something you overlook, but there doesn't seem to be much of a difference, that we're looking at the same types of organisms. Organisms haven't changed in one sense very much from the past to the present. It's not like we're sampling from another planet. We're sampling from the same planet, or the organisms of the present are perhaps genetically related to many of the organisms of the past, and even those that are extinct are very, very similar to those in the present. So Todd Wood has, for example, been working on fossil humans alongside modern humans, and when you play with those things together, the mathematics works out very similarly on fossils as it does on the living organisms. And Matt McLean has done a number of papers on the Mesozoic reptiles, Censuolato, and it looks, for those of you who don't know anything about Baraminology and sit in on these talks, it kind of looks like, but if you do that enough, it kind of looks the same, from the fossil talks and the talks on living organisms. And I'm putting a little bit of time into this just to say that the fossils really do represent organisms of the past, not just things, for example, created in the rocks or something. We have other reasons to believe they weren't created in the rocks, but this is sort of a confirmation that they really are sampling critters and plants of the past. Continuing in that regard, another theme on the subject of organisms of the past is that one can see extraordinary, amazing, beautiful designs in those fossil organisms. In the living organisms, one can see amazing, beautiful, spectacular designs because the God who created these things is amazing, beautiful, wonderful, and so on. And there's many examples in the creationist literature of, woo, look at the woodpecker and the design of all sorts of things. And there's much more that could be done because there are millions of species of organisms, and we've not even hardly scratched the surface about the amazing complexity and beauty of those things. But the fossil record adds another 125,000 species of critters that aren't in the present that also have evidences of amazing designs. Things like, the balance of a T-Rex form. It's beautiful. A T-Rex is a masterful design. Get these scrawny little hands. Why in the world do they have the scrawny little hands? Well, in part, as you increase the size of the organism, and this huge, massive jaw and that sort of thing, and you don't balance it somehow, little puppy's going to be boom! He's going to just be sitting there with his jaw on the ground and can't get up. I'm making fun of something that I shouldn't, but if you reduce the weight on the front end as you increase the size of the jaw and increase the mass of the tail, you can allow the organism to balance in such a way that on the pivot of the hip, he is equally balanced in mass. So he can sleep in a horizontal position. There's something like that, kind of like the horse. That's just really cool. You're a hard audience. So you got lycopods in the fossil record that have these seeds that land in the water and they float as a boat and they've got a sail. What? That's just... Are you kidding? Guess what? Those are plants that seem to be growing in the water. What a great design. God is just really cool. And it goes on and on. Trilobites, of course. Trilobite eyes, but we have not the time. An important point to make here, though, too, another point on the organisms of the past. For all of the organisms that we have in the present, the incredible diversity that we have in the present, there's a whole bunch of organisms in the past that are no more. Oh, you know about the dinosaurs. That's one of these words on here. Okay? There are hundreds of major groups. Now, I'm not talking about species. I'm not talking about genera. I'm not even talking about families. Orders, classes of organisms that are no more. We have a depauperate biota at the present. The critters that we have now, amazing diversity. But in the pre-flood world, the created world had even more diversity, even more beauty and interrelationship, I believe, among communities. It's an important fact to understand. The fossil record shows us there's a lot more in the fossils than there even is in the present. That's cool. Another thing on the organisms of the past. If you look at the oldest rocks on the planet, we have the only fossils we find therein are bacteria and some of the things bacteria seem to have produced, things like stromatolites. You've heard stroms being referred to here recently, today in particular. We don't find in those same sediments. Now there's thousands of feet of these rocks, but those are the only fossils in them. There are thousands of independent discoveries at independent levels throughout those rocks. They're all only bacteria. Only bacteria. No pollen. No pollen. Think about what that means. Pollen is much easier to preserve than a bacterium. Yet there's none there. Where do you find pollen? Pollen is everywhere. Pollen goes up into the atmosphere and is carried around the world. You cannot be anywhere without being rained upon by pollen. And those of you who enjoy allergies such as I, you know that that's true. Everywhere, you can't get away from it. So how do you have rocks, thousands of feet of rocks, with pollen, with no pollen, but bacteria? It doesn't just mean these are rocks formed somewhere where the plants aren't. It suggests these are rocks formed where plants are not anywhere on the planet. A time before the plants. Where's that? When is that? The plants are created at some point on day 3 of the creation week. Could it be that this is a window into events that occurred before the creation of plants on day 3? And if so, are we looking at God preparing the oceans of the earth for the organisms that are to be created later on that day? This makes the hair come up in the back. I love this. This is cool. Again, you see, paleontologists see fossils as living things. We see them alive. What are they doing? This is what God is doing to prepare the oceans for the fish and everything else. He prepares the biomatrix that Joe talked about before he creates the organisms that are dependent upon it. Cool stuff. Okay, the earliest flood sediments, I believe, there are differences here in that regard, seem to indicate from these, what I believe, earliest flood sediments, and associated with these papers are arguments for why I think that is, I see in a reef environment. Again, I'm seeing these things alive. I'm reconstructing the world that was by the fossils that remain. And what I see there is this huge continent, supercontinent, fringed by, on all sides, a reef, which perhaps is keeping the coast from being inundated by large waves or something. I don't know. But anyway, there's a large reef around it. But it's not like any other reef it's not like any reef we have today. Because it's not made of coral organisms. It's made of stromatolites. It's made of bacteria. Bacterial-made reefs. And as much as was said about the stromatolites today, nobody mentioned the really cool thing, I think, about stromatolites is that some of these puppies are kilometers in size. The scrawny little stromatolites you saw in the pictures are nothing compared to the enormous stromatolites. They are reefs. And in their reefs with nothing else there, I argued because there's nothing else there, these are hot water reefs, and that nothing else can live there except bacteria. So God designed the continent ringed with reefs, and then in the shade of the reef, inland from the reef, is a series of communities of organisms. You've got the reef on the outside edge, and then you've got a series of wild and wonderful communities of organisms. Again, looking at the fossil record, you see, there's the reef complex. Also right above it, we see the ediacaran fauna. Really weird stuff. It doesn't look that weird, actually, from what we perceive, but those are not jellyfish. They are not constructed the same way. The Dolph Zeilacher summarized the ediacaran fauna as a bunch of inner tubes. Think of those little plastic things that you lay on and float in the water. They've got these little tubes that you blow up, and all of these things are flat organisms with bulbous tubes. And they're just weird, completely weird stuff. And on top of them, or next to them, towards the shore, another fauna of really crazy, wonderful things, trilobites and so on and so forth. None of these organisms live in the present. None of them. It's a wild, fun. And then looking at up further in the record, we have insight into a whole bunch of plants, a sequence of plants from small plants low down to more and more complex and bigger plants that I have interpreted as a floating forest in the middle of the oceans of the world, continent-sized forest. Think North American continent-sized floating forest with an entire, with obviously a huge number of trees, and on the outside edge, plants designed for that transition between the floating forest and the center, which would have had solid soil that you could jump up and down on and not even know you were floating on the ocean, all the way out to very, very thin algae-like plants at the very edge on the oceans. A wonderful world, almost all of these plants being unfamiliar to us in the present, but the destruction of this thing during the flood having produced the Carboniferous coals of eastern US, Europe, and western Russia. In the upper flood, of course, we've got evidence of the dinosaurs and associated fauna. Below those forests, we find a wonderful world of shallow water marine organisms. We haven't focused on as much as we've done on dinosaurs and so on. As creationists, we have not reconstructed these communities. I still don't understand these communities as much as I think I understand the floating forest and, in fact, the reefal communities below. Where these puppies are, where is the shallow ocean, and how does it work? Because the conventional explanation that we have epiric seas, these broad seas, shallow seas across the continents, physics basically tells us they won't work because those should produce tides that will destroy all of those organisms. And so how does this work? Where are they located? And how is it that they can be buried on the continents while the dinosaurs have not yet been buried? And how can we have tens of thousands of feet at least of these critters buried over all the continents before we put the land organisms on top of them? How does that work? I don't know. So there's much reconstruction of pre-flood communities that needs to happen. And I think they're so cool to do it. We need to be doing it, and we got so much more fun to come. In the post-flood, what I believe to be the post-flood world, we have sequences of a series of organisms. For example, our paper on horses, where there's different horses low down than there are horses up at the top. And the modern horses are that little yellow crescent, which represents a dot that's kind of behind one of the little blue dots at the top. The 9 species, depending on how you count them, 3 species of ass, 3 species of horse, 3 species of zebra, all are in one little dot. Okay, think of the diversity among the living horses. Now that's how different these other horses are in the fossil record. We start with these 3-foot tall, not even that, little horses that can't eat grass. They eat, they're browsers, not grazers, and they can't run like modern horses. They apparently live in forests, not in prairies, because we don't even have prairies. What we see is the horses increase in size, increase in hypsidonia type of, they actually acquire different teeth at one point as they change their gait. At the same time, fossil spores indicate that grass appears in the middle of the Cenozoic in North America, spreads across North America, and the horses go into that open grassland for the first time. Now they can run. You don't run really fast through the forest without running into trees. So they're designed apparently, to respond somehow to the environment as it changed, as the earth cooled and dried after the flood. The horses apparently are designed by God to respond to the environment, and they change their gait, they change their diet, they change their teeth, they change their size. Everything changes in the horse and in 16 other mammal families at the same time. 16 different families acquire hypsodont teeth and become suited, adapted, designed for the prairie environment. Well, this is cool stuff. Okay, again, a window into something that was occurring in that period following the flood. How about processes of the past? That's not everything I had to say about organisms of the past, but for now, it's going to have to do. I guess I have like 2 minutes. First of all, marine fossils above sea level have been used by people to argue for a flood for a very long time. Tertullian said, hey, sea creatures on top of the mountains must mean there's a flood that went up to the top of the mountains. Used to be the argument of creationists. I hope no one makes that argument anymore. Okay, the fact that it's on a mountain, by definition, a mountain is deformed rock. Deformed rock has been pushed up to that high point. The flood didn't come to that level. Okay, they were formed down below and pushed up to that. So don't use the argument that fossils on top of mountains, marine fossils on top of mountains means the flood covered the earth. That's wrong. But if you find marine fossils in undeformed sediments, in flat-lying sediments that are sitting more than 90 meters above sea level, 90 meters being, if you melted all the glacial ice, it would raise the sea level up to that point. So if you have fossils in sediments that are 1,000 feet above sea level, undeformed sediments, now you got an argument for a flood. Because we've learned in geophysics, this is cool, that the continents sit high over the oceans because there's a keel of light, less dense material holding them up. So what we learn from this is that unlike I was taught in geology, the continents haven't been going whoop, 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 whoop. That hurts. I used to be able to do that, and it didn't hurt, but I can't do that anymore. Got to stop that. No, the evidence is that maybe you can push the continents down, but they're going to buoy right back up because of that keel. So you know what that means? When you see fossils in undeformed sediments 1,000 feet above sea level, they were probably deposited at 1,000 feet above modern sea level. That does mean that the flood was there. Okay? So we got to change our arguments a little bit. Let's see. I've already done that and gotten the rotten tomatoes thrown at me, so I will pass on to another issue. Fossils are fossilized. Organisms somehow get preserved. How is it that they get preserved? And some of the preservation is mind-boggling. Okay? Some of these things, there is... And so how do you make fossils? The old creationist argument is that the only way you make fossils is in a flood, is in a catastrophe. Please stop that, okay? That's ridiculous. We got fossils being made in the present. There's Saratoga Springs, New York. Every year you've got plant fossils being formed by the leaves that fall down into the spring and get preserved, and you've got fossils every single year. I can show you many examples. This doesn't require catastrophism, but some things seem to. Okay, when John Bell Hood found the first Edmontosaurus, he claims in his notes, this is that Edmontosaurus way up there at the top. That's a monster, by the way. That puppy is is like 20 feet tall or something. It's huge. He says he found it standing vertically, and these sediments are horizontal in that location. Okay, how in the world? That is not a reconstructed specimen. That is what is carved out of the rock. Okay, it's a nearly complete specimen, apparently standing. That requires catastrophism to bury that puppy in a standing position. And we got mummies of dinosaurs. We've got nautiloids that are lined up, which indicate that there were bodies in there. All those arguments are too complex. I got 0 minutes, okay, to talk about. Okay, I'll just have to. There are evidence from fossils for underwater deposition. There's evidence from fossils for strange and wild chemistry of the past. We've got fossils of individual cells and dividing cells. What? Are you kidding? Can you really do that? The most abundant fossil in the Mazon Creek Formation, which is probably the best invertebrate fossil collecting locality in the world. The most abundant fossil animal is, guess what? A jellyfish. I mean, they have all sorts of other things in there, but the most abundant animal is a jellyfish. How do you preserve a jellyfish? That's pretty cool. It means some chemistry is going on that is wildly different than the present. John Whitmore on the film was talking about a very different chemistry required to explain the Green River Formation after the flood. We've got evidence of really weird and wild chemistry throughout the record of paleontology. Let's see. Well, okay, that wasn't bad. The last thing I want to say is it's sort of the future. What does really puzzle me at this point? A very strong biozonation in the record. Unlike creationist claim, and I've heard it here a number of times, there is not a mixing of marine and non-marine organisms in the fossil record. When I'm looking at the Lance Creek Formation finding dinosaurs, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of specimens been taken out of that formation. It's a half a mile thick. And there are 3, to my knowledge, known marine fossils. They're all shells at the very bottom of the formation, which sits right on top of an entirely marine formation. So they're probably just kicked up from that lower formation. Otherwise, it's a half mile of freshwater organisms and land organisms. Marcus worked on another group of sediments that are the same age as those of the Lance Creek. But all of those fossils are marine with no terrestrial organisms in them. The flood has an amazing ability that we don't understand in keeping organisms together in communities and not mixing them. That is the most... Now, I know why you don't want to say that. Because it's going to be used against the creation model. How in the world can you separate and keep separate? I suspect, for example, that we're picking up those communities, circling them around the world multiple times before we lay them down. And we do so carefully without mixing them with all the other communities we're carrying around the world. Okay, that's my crazy idea, okay? You can shoot me for that, that's fine. The point is that we've got some explanation to do here, which gives us insight into something really cool that's happening during the flood. We've got a lot of work to do. Let's get to work. Thank you.